It's a privilege to be with all of you here. I thank you for allowing a geezer in here between me and Jeff's father. I think we're probably it, so thank you for being inclusive. It's the privilege of my life for 35 years to have worked with gang members, and the day will never come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than the thousands of gang members I've been privileged to know. People like Luis Perez, who for like 10 years he helped run Homeboy Industries, and he was a shot caller from his gang and a heroin addict, and then in recovery and in prison for a stretch. And then he was a real good speaker. You know, I mean, high schools would ask for him by name, and he liked inhabiting that role. And we went out to dinner, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly. And he said, you know, you have to pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. And I said, yeah, no shit. That is some good advice there. So brace yourselves. Here's what I think. I think we're all called to kind of imagine something different. So how do we imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle? How do we go from your days together here to somehow dismantle the barriers that exclude? How do we inch our way out to the margins so we can stand in such a way that the margins get erased? How we can stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. We can stand with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. How do we stand in this privileged place with the easily despised and the readily left out? How do we get to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away? How do we go to the margins, not to make a difference, really, but so that the folks at the margins make us different? You know, there are a great many Buddhist texts that begin with these beautiful words. "O nobly born, remember who you really are." You go to the margins so that we all together can inhabit our own nobility and dignity together. And you brace yourself as you go to the margins, because people will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." You go to the margins and other voices get heard. Last Saturday, I buried my 229th young person killed because of gang violence. And 10,000 gang members a year walk through our doors at Homeboy wanting to reimagine their lives. All of them are used to being watched, and none of them are used to being seen. If I could speak personally, not that long ago, I buried my 92-year-old mama who had 8 kids, and she died in her own home, surrounded by all 8 of her kids. I buried my dad about 23 years ago. And she was sharp as a tack till the very end. I mean, in the last year of her life, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she wasn't a lick afraid of dying. In fact, a couple weeks before she died, she said with exhilaration, you know, "I've never done this before." You know, something you might say before skydiving, you know. And in fact, the day before she died, her last words to me, she was asleep and I was sitting there alone, and she woke up and she saw me and she said, "Oh, for crying out loud." And she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed off that she hadn't died yet, you know, and sorry, you know. And the next day, as luck would have it, I was sitting again, the only one there. Usually my sibs were, there were a lot of us there. And at exactly noon, she just opened her eyes and she let out this tiny, glorious, wondrous gasp, skydiving. And no one in earshot of this sound could ever be afraid of death again. But I mention all this because in the last weeks of her life, there'd be 2 of us, 5 of us, all 8 of us standing around her bed, and she'd be out. And when she woke up, she would lock onto one of us, and she'd say with breathless delight, "You're here, you're here." And it's the only thing human beings ever care about, really, is somebody there to kind of extend this tender glance, to just look you in the eye and say, "Oh, nobly born, remember who you really are. You're here." Our first social enterprise was the bakery, started in 1992, and it was quite famous because it was an exit ramp off this crazy freeway of gang violence. But it burned to the ground in October of '99, and it was a faulty kind of wiring. And I remember we called all the homies to come the next day, and we couldn't find this one kid, Danny. So he showed up for work, and again, these were like 18 rival enemies from rival gangs, guys who used to shoot at each other. Now they're baking bread. And Danny showed up, and his uniform was ironed and said Homeboy Bakery emblazoned on it, and his step is light as he walks from the bus, and he walks into the parking lot, and he sees the soggy mess that the firefighters had pulled out, and he sees the smoke still wafting through the roof, and he sees his co-workers, enemies, rivals, picking through the rubble, and he realizes what's happened, and he holds his face in his hands, and he just begins to sob, because this was more than a job. It was his reason to get up in the morning, and more importantly, the reason not to gangbang the night before. So we surrounded him with our abrazos and promises of rebuilding, and now we're thriving in 2019, a huge bakery. But when it started, it got a lot of attention. We'd have a lot of tour groups, busloads of Japanese tourists, and Prince Charles's business advisors, and it was kind of a big deal. And our foreman was a guy named Roman, who was one of the biggest drug dealers I'd ever known, and I knew all of them in the housing projects where I was pastor. And he finally gave up selling drugs and was willing to work at the bakery. But then because he was a leader in his gang, I ended up making him the foreman. And it's hard enough to work with your enemies. It's even harder to supervise them. But he gave tours whenever the TV crew came or the bus loads, and he hated giving tours. And we're standing out in front of the bakery. We're waiting for a busload of farmers from Central Valley of California, people who owned farms. And he's having a bad attitude day. And the bus pulls in, and I said, "Hi, and you can park right over there." And it has one of those buses with the microphone on the bus, for the tour guide. And Roman pretends he's the tour guide, on the bus. He said, "Welcome to Homeboy Bakery. Observe gang members in their natural habitat. Please keep your hands in the bus at all times. Do not attempt to feed the homies. They are not yet tame." I'm saying, "Cállate, cabrón." And a bus pulls in, and I leave them with Roman, and I go to our office in those days on First Street. And so I come back later in the afternoon, and I see him, and it triggers the memory of the tour. And I said, "Hey, how'd that tour go this afternoon?" And he said, "Damn, gee, what's up with white people anyway?" I said, "I don't know. What's up with us?" He said, "Well, they always be using the word great." I said, "Really, we do? I didn't know that." He goes, "Yeah, check this out. This busload of gabachos, white people, come in, and they see the bakery and the ovens, and everything's clean and everything's working. This place is great." and they see the homies, enemies, rivals working side by side with each other. You fellas are great. And then they try the bread and they say, wow, this bread, it's great. He goes, how come white people always be using the word great? And I said, I don't know, and from that day forward, trust me, every opportunity I could find, I told him how great he was just to mess with him. And we'll cut to about 6 months later. I go as the bakery is closing at 11 o'clock at night, and I pull in, and Roman rushes me at the car, which he never does. I mean, he was never excited about anything. And I get out of the car, and he says, you're not going to believe what happened yesterday. So he tells me that he finished his shift, and he goes to pick up his 4-year-old daughter, Clarissa, at the babysitter's. And they drive to their humble little apartment where, for the first time in his life, he's paying rent with honestly earned, clean, decent money, raising his daughter all by himself. And he unlocks the front door, and little Clarissa goes running in the little tiny hallway, and she lands in the sala, in the living room, and she plants her feet, and she takes the room in with her eyes, and she says, this is great. And he said, I thought she was turning white on me. And he gets down at eye level, and he says, Mija, what's great? And little Clarissa clutches her chest with great emotion, and she says, my home. And as soon as he says those 2 words, instantly, he and I, our eyes fill with tears, and they began to roll slowly down our cheeks. And it felt like an eternity before I finally broke the silence. And I said, you did this. You've never had a home in your life, and now you got one. You did this. You used to be the biggest drug dealer in town, and you stopped and you baked bread instead. You did this. You've never been a father in your life. You've never had one, and now you are one. And I hate to have to tell you, but you're great. And I hate to have to tell you that the first time I ever retrieved the story to tell it for the very first time was, in fact, at his funeral. And Roman was packing the trunk of his car to go on a camping trip, and 2 guys came into the part of the projects where he lived with their faces covered, and they saw him, and they must have thought, he'll do, and they executed him. And the question I was most asked by his friends and homies in the course of the week that spanned his death to his funeral was a good question. What's the point of doing good if that can happen to you? And I found myself telling that story to a packed church, and then I said, here was the point, that before Roman left us, he discovered the truth of who he was, that he was exactly what God had in mind when God made him. And so he became that truth. He inhabited that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it. Because it's great. No matter what you do or what you start, we're all called to be enlightened witnesses, people who, through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love, return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're so allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking gang members to measure up. Instead, we hold the mirror up and tell them that they're exactly right, knowing that we have to reach in and dismantle messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. Knowing that if you don't make friends with your own wound, you may well be tempted to despise the wounded. Long lay the world in sin and error, pining till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. And yeah, it's a song about Jesus and about Christmas. But how is it not the job description of every human being? You appear and the soul feels its worth. People aren't watched, they're seen. You're here. You're here. I've been a priest for 35 years, and for all those years, I say Mass, celebrate services in all these detention facilities on a rotating basis every Saturday. And then I race home to do, on a Saturday, because I've lived in the Dolores Mission community, the poorest parish in Los Angeles. And so my Saturdays are always the same, 1 o'clock baptism, 2 o'clock quinceañera, where a girl turns 15, 3 o'clock wedding, 4 o'clock exorcism. Just checking to see if you're still listening. I've actually never done one of those. But I raced home, and it was like 20 minutes to 12, and I thought, I have time to go to my office to go through the mail. And there I am, contento, feliz, opening the mail all by myself. When all of a sudden this woman walks in. I find out her name is Lisa. She's 35 years old, gang member, prostitute, heroin addict, felon, parolee. This is the first time she's ever stepped foot in my office. And now I notice that it's 12 minutes to 1 and my baptism. She comes into my office and she plunks herself down in a chair and she launches right in. I need help. Ooh, I've been to like 50 rehabs. I'm known all over, nationwide. And then she kind of takes a detour. She says, I went to Catholic schools all my life, graduated from elementary. I even graduated from Sacred Heart High School in Lincoln Heights. And then she gets quiet and still. And she says, in fact, the first time I ever used heroin was right after I graduated. And I've been trying to stop since the moment I began. And I watched as she leaned her head against the wall behind her, and her eyes became like two ponds, water rising to meet its edges and spilling over. And she cried, and I let her cry, until finally she leveled her gaze at me, and she said with great deliberation, I am a disgrace. And suddenly her shame met mine, because when I had seen her step into my office that afternoon, I had mistaken her for an interruption. O nobly born, remember who you really are. I had a homie named Bandit, who I used to ride my bike in the middle of the night in the projects, and he was a gang member and a drug dealer and always resisted any offer of help I would give him. Until one day he stepped into my office and I couldn't believe my eyes. And he said what gang members often say, I'm tired of being tired. And so he started to work at Homeboy, a place that has a community of tenderness that people can leave behind, the big old backpack filled with chronic toxic stress. They can find rest. They can re-identify who they are. They can own some resilience, and then they can leave us. As he did, and we found him a job after his time with us. I hadn't heard from him in a long time. He worked in a warehouse, and then he became the supervisor, and then married, kids, house. Well, no news is good news from gang members, but one day he calls me on a Friday afternoon, and he was kind of in a panic. He says, you gotta bless my daughter. I said, ¿Qué pasó, mijo? Is she sick? in the hospital. And he goes, no. On Sunday, my little Jessica, she's going to college. Imagine. She's just a little chaparrita, a little short thing. But she's going to Humboldt College, and it's way up north. And do you think you could give her a blessing before she goes? I said, are you kidding? I'd be honored. Look, tomorrow is Saturday. I have an exorcism at 1. Why don't you come at 12:30 and we'll do a little send-off? And sure enough, there's Bandit and his wife and his 3 kids, including tiny little Jessica. So I said, let's stand in front of the altar and let's kind of make a circle around Jessica and everybody touch her, hang on to her. And I said, close your eyes and bow your heads. And as the homies would say, I do a long-ass prayer. I go on. And somewhere in the middle of this thing, I noticed that we've all become chillones. We're all just blubbering. We're all crying. And I don't know why we're crying, except for the fact that Bandit and his wife don't know anybody who's ever gone to college except me. Certainly nobody in their families. And so, we wipe our eyes and we kind of, laugh at how mushy we got. And so to change the subject, I turned to Jessica and say, hey, what are you going to study at Humboldt College? And she was very quick, forensic psychology. I go, damn, forensic psychology. And Bandit chimes in and says, yeah, she wants to study the criminal mind. And she looks over at her father and she does one of these, and he sees her and he laughs and he says, yeah, I'm going to be her first subject. So we go out to the car and big abrazos, everybody piles in the car, but Bandit hangs back and so I'm glad he has. And I said, hey, Mijo, I give you credit for the man you've chosen to become, for choosing to walk in your own footsteps. I'm proud of you. And his eyes fill up with tears, and he says, you know what? I'm proud of myself. All my life, people called me a lowlife, a bueno para nada, a good for nothing. I guess I showed them. I said, yeah, I guess you did. And the soul feels its worth. Exactly right. I don't think you go to the margins to make a difference, because then it's about you. You go to the margins so that folks make you different. And then it's about us. And then people are seen. And then we inhabit our dignity and our unshakable goodness together. Let me end with this. It occurs sometimes to universities to invite me to speak after they've forced their students to read my books against their will. I'm not complaining, but my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, forced their incoming freshmen to read Tattoos on the Heart, and they said, could you come and speak? We'll have a big venue, 1,000 people. And I said, sure. And they said, could you bring 2 homies with you? And I always do when people are going to pay for it, and I always pick homies the same way among our 500 trainees. I always pick enemies, rivals from different gangs, just to force them to share a hotel room together, just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of singing Gang Members Panicked in the Sky. It was not that long ago at LAX, I had 2 older vatos, and one of them, dead serious, said, hey, G, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, well, yeah, it's a requirement, we'll be coming home on American, but So I picked two homies, Bobby, an African-American gang member who worked in the bakery at the time, and Mario, who worked in our merchandise store in our huge headquarters in Los Angeles. I've done this almost 1,000 times with men and women. I've never picked anybody more terrified of flying than this guy, Mario. I mean, he was just petrified to the bone. He was hyperventilating, you know. And we hadn't even, you know, boarded the plane yet. And so we were at Burbank Airport, which is kind of a tiny airport, and big bay windows, Southwest Airlines, big planes, but you don't have that hermetically sealed chute to board the plane. You have to walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb up the stairs to go to the front of the plane, and the stairs at the back of the plane, which is the big feature at Burbank. And so I'm sitting there with Mario. Bobby's off walking somewhere in the airport, and our plane arrives, and it's early morning, and people are deplaning. And I turn to Mario, and I go, you know, that's going to be our plane. And Mario goes, and I think, wow, he may die before we actually climb up those stairs, you know. And then our flight crew arrives, and you know, and I see two flight attendants, females. Both of them have very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps, you know. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, well, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. So I should tell you that in our 31-year history as an organization, Mario is the most tattooed individual who's ever worked there, which is really saying something. He's all sleeved out, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say the end, so that, you know, when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt for anybody. And so I'm trying to calm him down, and I'm walking them through the airport, and people are like this, you know, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely, and I think, wow, isn't that interesting? Because if you were to go to Homeboy tomorrow, and walk into our huge headquarters, walk up to anybody who works there, quick, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here, they won't say me. They'll say, Mario. Yeah, Mario. Mario works in the cafe now. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. So we get to Gonzaga, and there's a big, huge talk at night, but they don't tell you there are 94 other talks all damn day, you know, with this class, this lunch, this meeting, this class. So I tell Mario and Bobby, I'm not going to speak at any of them. I want you to get up and tell your stories, and they're nervous, especially Mario, but they do a good job. Stories of torture and terror and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind, and honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So we get to the big venue, and I coax the two of them to get up before me and do a 7-minute each version of their story. And Mario was completely petrified, but again, they did a good job. I got up and did my thing, and then I invite them to stand on either side of me for the Q&A. And yes, ma'am, and a woman stands, and she goes, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario is a tall, skinny drink of water, and he clutches the microphone, and he says, yes. And he's just terrified. And she says, well, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? You know, what advice do you give them? And Mario closes his eyes, and he clutches the microphone intently, and he's starting to tremble, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say, when suddenly he blurts out, as soon as he says those two words, he rushes back to his microphone-clutching, closed-eyed refuge. But he wants to get the whole sentence out even though certainly he's about to lose his battle with his tears. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. And she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping, and all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And they, in turn, returned to themselves. And the soul felt its worth. Human beings seeing each other and saying, you're here. You're here. And so you go to the margins because it's the only way they'll get erased if you stand out at them. And pretty soon you cease to care if anybody accuses you of wasting your time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you all very much.